with some nerdy peeps, writers and cartoonists and so much more. Oh yeah, so stick around and have some fun with the lovely and adorable evil web.
Hello, my babies. Hey, just to let you know before we start, this episode might be difficult for some people to listen to. It contains serious discussion about sexual abuse, depression, and trauma. My personal feeling is that this one is worth listening to, but if this kind of subject matter is too much for you, I would totally understand if you wanted to opt out of this episode. Love you, babies. Okay, so in this issue, we're featuring Glenn Head. Glenn began making comics when he was 14 years old. His work has appeared in many places, from the Wall Street Journal to Screw. Others include the New York Times, Playboy, New Republic, Sports Illustrated, Advertising Age, Interview, and Entertainment Weekly. Glenn's fine art has been exhibited in New York and across the country. Exit Art's traveling cartoon art show, Comic Power, Art and Provocation, Images from Rebels, at the Boulder Museum of Fine Art, and the New York Press Illustrator Show at CBGB's Gallery. Glenn's editorial cartooning has appeared in Ink's show at Hofstra University. In the 90s, Glenn co-created Snake Eyes and the Harvey Award-nominated Cutting Edge Comics anthology series. His solo books include Avenue D and Guten Snipe, underground urban comics that capture the intense, gritty underbelly of street life. Head was a frequent contributor to the Fantagraphics Comics anthology, Quarterly 00. And today, we're going to talk to him about his latest project, an autobiographical memoir, Chartwell Manner. So I hear that you are putting out a new book. It's a memoir. What's it about?
The book is called Chartwell Manner, and it's a boarding school memoir. It's not just about that. That's what gets the book going. It's, I'd say, about maybe the first quarter of the book, maybe a fifth. And what it gets going with, the book begins in 1971, essentially, when I'm first at this boarding school. And it's this kind of gothic horror story, actually, although it's told first person, and it is a memoir. And it's about the time I did at this boarding school between 1971 and 1973, from age 13 to 15. And that's kind of the inciting incident, or what gets the ball rolling with the whole story. And that is just sort of the initial action. It's not really the center of the book, although it is what gets it going. It's in a lot of ways a family drama about myself and my parents, and about the aftermath of being at this school.
And the incident was abuse.
Yeah, the incident was abuse. The incident was actually plenty of things, but it was mainly being put into a really strange Gothic environment. It seemed almost like a haunted castle, and it seemed like being sent somewhere else from where I'd been growing up at home in the suburbs of Madison, New Jersey. And I ended up in this school, which was really all about British discipline. And you can imagine what that might mean. It wasn't good, but it was an unusual time. It was a time, as I say, in the early 70s, when abuse was not recognized as something that actually happened. And so you were sort of dealing with a world unto itself. And this school that was called Chartwell Manor, we were told what happens here stays here. And we were also told we were on our honor to not fill anyone else in about what was going on. So basically, a lot of what the tension of the story is having some of these bad things happen, physical and sexual abuse, which happened to a great many kids there, including myself. And the tension of keeping that hidden and then letting that out at a later point in life. So yeah, that's how the story moves. That's how it reads. That's what it's about.
And you sort of went through different phases with it, and you used your art as a way of dealing with it and coping with it.
Yeah, that would be an accurate description of it. I mean, being sent to this school for the first time, because I was in a different world and I needed to find a way to cope. And there were fears of both the other kids to some extent, and in particular, the headmaster himself. And my realization that corporal punishment and other things of that sort were definitely going to be in the mix, it forced me to need to find an escape, to find a voice, to find a way out. And what that was at that time was drawing. I was 13 and I was learning for the first time how to draw and to come up with some decent drawing that other kids liked. So that was a way out of the world I was in. It was a sort of an escape valve of sorts. And the book is about that. The book is about the process of that, of experiencing art as a way to cope, and also finally to really be gripped by underground comics, which is what also happened while I was there.
That was actually, I thought that particular part of the story was extremely interesting. Just sort of the way. So he's telling the story about his experience with Satan worshippers, and there's a goat there, and this picture that you formed around it was just it was neat. It was a really interesting way to tell it.
Yeah, it was interesting to put that in there because, I mean, in one way, you feel like this headmaster who's kind of almost like a cult leader who's keeping these kids under control, maybe telling the kids this devil worship story just to keep them in a state of fear, and he doesn't really believe it. Or on the other hand, when he's telling the story and he's talking about being in his office with the windows down and the curtains flapping around and he feels Satan's presence, that was the scariest part, more than him talking about the devil worship itself that he had seen where this goat is sacrificed. Because it really seemed like he believed that the devil wanted him to do things, that the devil was in fact real to him. And that's really scary to a kid because, a kid is always looking to the adult for guidance and for some understanding of what reality is. And if the headmaster believes that all this stuff is real and the child is in an environment that is new and alien, the child may not know himself whether such things are true or not. So that was an especially kind of terrifying moment. And so I was also trying to work in a feeling of something being almost phantasmagorical even before that happens, where I'm hanging out with a kid, a friend of mine, and we're smoking cigarettes. And he tells me that Sir, as this headmaster, that's the name he insists on going by, is coming in tonight to tell a bedtime story. And I asked, what kind of stories does he tell? And the kid says, weird. And if you look at the art in that panel, it is weird. And so it's like a sort of quasi-realism, a lot of the drawing here.
The book almost, it's really appropriate that it starts off in the 70s because the vibe that the art style has, it does feel like an underground comic from the 70s. It really has that same sort of layout and flavor to it.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, that's where a lot of my influences are. There's others as well, but that's something I was definitely working out in the book. Definitely.
I've heard people describe your art as surreal. Is there a conscious decision there, or is that just the way the style works?
I don't know that I make a lot of conscious decisions about stylistic choices too much. I am heavily indebted not just to underground comics, but also to, say, Chester Gould, Dick Tracy, and the use of black that he did. And those are just, I guess, early learning experiences that really informed my work. But as far as like conscious choices in terms of style, I don't actually make any. I usually am kind of surprised by cartoonists that might come up with a new style for each comic they do. I could never do that. I just pretty much draw the way I draw.
And this one isn't actually your first comics memoir.
Yeah, this is actually my second. The previous one that I did was a book called Chicago, which was about being 19 years old and homeless and crazy and being on the streets of Chicago after dropping out of art school in Cleveland and meeting my heroes, which in that case was a lot of these underground cartoonists whose work I had kind of worshipped. And, you know, it's that's what the story is about, is kind of, you know, what that's like when you meet your heroes. And it's invariably, if not a disappointment, then it's not the pie in the sky thing that a teenager might be expecting.
How did your career in comics begin?
Well, actually, I guess, like I was saying earlier, it may have begun at Chartwell Manner. I mean, insofar as like that was when I first really got hip to what these comics were about. And again, that's why I bring it up in the story, the whole thing of my seeing underground comics at that time, because, see, everything that was going on in that school was not appropriate for any kid, whether the kid was my age, 13, or 5 or 6 or 8 years old, which a lot of other kids were. And that inappropriateness then was kind of, you could say, echoed by some of the material that I then saw in underground comics. And I feel like that was a kind of a rude awakening, but really a kind of awakening to what comics can do, which is take you someplace you might not want to go. Just like you wouldn't want to go to Chartwell Manor as a kid, you might not want to go into the world of what certain underground cartoonists are drawing. And I think that's what really grabbed me, was that it could take you someplace, take you out of the world, take you into someplace possibly much more frightening, much more surreal. And so that was like the very beginning. And I really started drawing comics at that time. That was when I first began to draw comics. And then, of course, through high school. I was part of a group of cartoonists from the early 80s into the 90s, sort of in New York, doing what I think of as kind of post-underground comics, in which case I was editing a book, an anthology with another cartoonist by the name of Kaz. And we were collecting work by different people and putting it out. At that time, that was one of the only ways to get one's work out. You could put out a solo book, but anthology books were really still a thing then. And you may be familiar with Zap Comics, which was an anthology. That was an underground comic that Robert Crumb started, and then other artists were in. And of course, before that, you could say one of the real anthologies was Harvey Kurtzman's Mad, which also had a lot of individual idiosyncratic styles. That, by the way, is something that is very important to me in underground comics and in comics just generally, that there be a strong individual voice and that you can immediately sense what the sensibility is of that artist. As soon as you get a look at the visuals, they are telling you what kind of world you're stepping into. I guess in a way that you could say you get with Chartwell Manor. As soon as you pick that book up and you look at some of those pages that are happening in that boarding school, you get a feel for what kind of Gothic environment you've stepped into, okay? So anyway, that was the way I was working in comics, first as an editor with this other artist and collecting other people's work and getting it out. And I continued on that level for a while and then continued doing that as well as putting out some of my own solo books. I put out a book called Avenue D and a couple of other books called Gutter Snipe. And yeah, it definitely grew out of this underground comics world, but, developed its own voice as time went on. And as time went on, as you're aware, comics were, first of all, underground comics were not for kids. And comics, as we know them, as independent comics or underground comics, have not been for kids. They've been dealing with much more, grown-up themes, so to speak, particularly autobiography. Now, you could also say that underground comics really were the beginning of that because those styles were so unique, the voices so unique, and the point of view so unique that basically it was their own world. And so it was going to evolve into telling personal stories about their own personal life. And things have developed along those lines since then. Where I'm going with this is that comics kind of stopped being comics, this sort of pamphlet-y thing that you picked up quite some time ago. And comics, as they exist now, are art books with comics in them. So it's definitely not the disposable thing anymore, which I kind of miss sometimes, but that's the way it's evolved. That's what it's evolved into. Yeah, it's almost as if the graphic novel is the only game in town, except for however people are getting them out there on the web. I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Are you doing much with digital, just in general?
Just basically paper. I'm not really interested in digital. I mean, except insofar as you have to do color work, and the only way to do color work is basically digitally. I mean, as far as I can see, you could paint and then tweak it, but as far as digital is concerned, that's the major thing. Everything, the repro of all of it is done digitally, so you have to get your hands dirty with that. But other than that, no, I don't really have any interest in those kinds of comics. I mean, one thing that I'll say, one thing that's really changed is see, there used to be a kind of apprenticeship in comics, in independent comics, where what people did was they would self-produce, self-publish their own comics, usually some kind of Xerox press thing. And it might only be 8, 10, or 15 pages. And then they would hand them out at conventions or give them to some store on consignment. And they would do that. And by trial and error, they would get better and better or not. And then they would try to move from there to try to finding a publisher to trying to get it out that way. So that's sort of an age-old way to deal with the process of learning it. And that went away. So basically, you can, I suppose, do all your comics on the web now. I don't know. I'm not really that familiar with how that stuff is done myself, but I believe that's the case to some extent.
Yeah. I feel like there used to be a whole room, when you'd go into a convention just before you hit the main artist room. And that would be where you'd find your sort of entry tier, low budget, print comics on a Xerox guys. You don't really have that anymore.
No, you don't. Now that's kind of too bad. It was a cool thing. I don't know. I mean, I guess you don't even hear about it that much, or at least I don't. I guess people still read books on Kindle and all that. That was a bigger thing. It seemed like 5 years ago or so, but I don't know. I could be wrong. But my point is just that, I really prefer holding an object in my hand that I'm reading than getting it in any other way. And I really love the feel of comics, the cheap disposable comics that used to be a thing. And I like the feel of a graphic novel too. It's got some weight, some heft to it, and feels like something real. So yeah, as opposed to floating around in cyberspace or whatever you call
it. There's a note in the beginning of your book where you talk about how you worked really hard, not to embellish or change anything to make anybody look bad or worse or better than they actually were.
This is too big a subject for me, in all honesty, for me to do it any other way than the way that I did it, because I really felt like I needed to give the devil his due, so to speak. And that in particular, I might be saying about Terrence Michael Lynch, the headmaster. He really deserved his due. See, this school lasted for about 15 years, and it did a lot of harm to a lot of kids, a lot of people. And it's not like just anybody could draw this book. Not just anybody could send him to hell, which I did by the end of the book. And so it was very important to me to capture that in all its twisted glory, so to speak. I mean, I really saw this guy as almost kind of a demented underground comics parody of a boarding school headmaster. He was kind of absurd, ridiculous, and florid in his speech patterns and all this stuff. And I really wanted to nail him in the way that he was. I didn't have to turn up the volume on him to make him more of a villain. I wouldn't really want to do that. But see, one thing I also really like about the graphic novel form is that you really can develop characters in a way that, at least for me, I wasn't able to do in the typical 8, 10, 15-page comic, because there's too much, happening between the panels for you to really develop it. Whereas here, as I say, this is in some ways a family story. And it's very important that the reader grasp the anxiety, say, of the character of my mother, who can't handle the truth, so to speak, can't handle hearing about what went on there, or my father's own evasiveness about it. So you can really make a character close to three-dimensional when working in a graphic novel. That's one of the great things about it. You can really develop them. Maybe I'm going off on a tangent here. What was the original question? But yeah, I know I remember. You asked me about, was it hard to portray these things honestly? And that's really the only way I would know how to do this. I couldn't, it was important to me to not make the kids look any worse than they did, because some of the kids, especially the ones that I hung out with, were sort of juvenile delinquent types a little bit. And I was more of a hanger-on to that because I was mostly spending all my time drawing. But those kids didn't ask to be there. They weren't done any favors by it being put there. And, I liked them. They were basically, good kids just in bad situations. And like all of us, we were just trying to navigate through that. So I didn't want to make any of them look bad. I don't really want to make anybody look bad. I mean, that's actually something that I'd say is that, like, I would never do a book like this as some kind of takedown of anybody. I don't really like that aspect of comics to a certain extent. I understand it, the whole lampooning aspect and the making fun of different characters, maybe characters you knew. I find that a little cheap and easy, and I'm not really looking to do that. I mean, I really see my role here as a cartoonist being kind of a truth teller, a storyteller that's trying to dig deeply enough into this story to give you something, as opposed to what's, say, right on the surface,
So what sort of emotional place does a story like this occupy?
It's kind of hard to answer, because the way I kind of look at some of this is, if you're ready to handle material like this, that is, use it as material, use it as story, to a certain extent, it doesn't affect you that much emotionally to be able to do it, at least on one level. It didn't take much out of me to draw this headmaster. It was weird drawing him doing some of the things he did, like attacking me physically, and like, the kind of physical abuse that I suffered. That's kind of weird to do. But on the other hand, a lot of the time when I'm working with material like this, I can almost go into a fugue state, and it's almost like I'm looking at a movie of something that happened, and I happen to be in it, but it happened so long ago that it might as well be a movie that I saw back in 1971. So emotionally, the story demanded that I draw it and I give it my very best, but the story didn't scare me. And it's weird to have it out there, and it's weird to draw Terrence Michael Lynch as a cartoon character. But in another way, it's not so weird at all, because in a lot of respects, he really was like a cartoon character. So, yeah.
Do you have to unwind after a project like this?
I don't know. Actually, I mean, I started my next book as soon as I finished this one, and I was waiting to see what was going on when I finished it. I finished this book a little while ago. I finished the actual drawing of it about a year ago. So, that was like the depths of COVID, and we were waiting to see what was going to go on with everything. And that was a real scary time because, as you may remember, the publishing world was if not caving in, then there were fears that it might. So I was just hoping that I still had a publisher, which turned out I did. And in the meantime, I got COVID. So that's one way I unwound, by being pretty sick. That. But then I started my next book because I am working out a cycle, I guess you'd call it, of memoir. And this is my second. And there's a third one that's in the works. So if that's unwinding, that's unwinding. That's what I'm doing.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of a drive to create, tell your story, and you just keep going.
Yeah, that's pretty true, actually. It is. I'm happiest when I'm working, when I'm drawing comics. It was not always the case. Drawing comics is actually, you probably hear this from a lot of cartoonists, I would imagine, a lot of hard work. But if you do it for long enough, you get to where you know pretty much everything that's going to get thrown at you. And you either have a good solution for what's going to be thrown at you as a cartoonist, or you've got at least a working solution for what's going to get thrown at you as a cartoonist. So, yeah, you get to where you can handle a lot of hours doing it, and it's bearable at worst and good at best.
So what's the drive to create, to talk about your story?
Okay, here's what I'll say about that. I've done a lot of that. Most of the fictional stuff I've done is or was sort of quasi-autobiographical anyway. It was mostly based on some of my own behavior, and I might anthropomorphize a character like, say, a snowman or an alligator or something, and tell that story through that. That's one way you make up a character, and you sort of work through a story that maybe you know, and you can take it in any direction you want because it's not something that happened to you, so you're not beholden to the truth. And I understand why people that work in fiction are really attracted to that because, the sky's the limit. Anything you can make up, you can draw, and you're allowed total freedom, right? That's all well and good. That's great. And I understand wanting to do that, and I've done it. What's drawn me to telling stories about my own past, I wouldn't do it if I didn't have what I perceive to be as very strong stories. Because in actual fact, growing up and studying comics when I was at art school, when I was at SVA in the early 80s, we had autobiography pushed on us. And I didn't particularly want to do it, but a lot of the stuff that I was doing back then, it was pretty well received. And I felt I had a knack for doing it, telling stories about myself as a character. See, if you're going to do autobiography, you have to make yourself into a character. It's not you, it's you on paper doing cartoon character kind of stuff, but it's a version of you. And so I got into doing that, and I realized you could get to a deeper level. And I also realized that some of what I felt to be ultimately, when I really looked critically at the medium of comics, of independent comics or underground comics, that a lot of the very best of what had happened in that medium was in fact autobiographical. Not always, because autobiography can be boring, and that's what you don't want to do. You want to have a story that's gripping, that will grab people, that they will really want to know, they will be invested in it as much as they would if it were any other kind of comic. That's crucial. You have to have that. I've had the kind of life where I feel that I have some of those kinds of stories. So that's why I do it. If I didn't, I would be making stuff up. Because as you noticed, my stuff is kind of surreal. And I really love the imaginative aspect of comics. A lot of stuff that I've really loved is really wild and imaginative. What I realized is that you can actually do that with your own personal stories. They can go pretty far into your psychic state, which is what interests me. They can go very far that way. So you're not actually limited as much as you might think, or as much as I might have thought, by telling personal stories about what I've experienced. You can go very far in doing them as well. So I guess that's pretty much the size of it. I just feel like there's a lot that can be done with it. And one thing I've noticed is that the memoir in the literary field is not really thought to be on the highest echelon in, say, literature and books. It's thought to be, well underneath the novel and the historical novel. Whereas in comics, that's not really quite the case. A lot of the best, or thought to be critically, some of the very best work is autobiographical in the field of comics. Now, I think that's also simply because the work that comes across autobiographically has its own uniqueness. It doesn't have a tendency to be, say, a documentary in the way that, say, a nonfiction book might be sort of documentary in style, trying to go for the facts. When you read a book like Chartwell Manner, there's nothing about it that's telling you this is it. It's in its entirety. You're getting that this is Glenn Head's story in its entirety, in the way that he experienced it, in the way that he felt it, in the way that it affected him. And inherent in that is the telling you that it's just his story, right? So it's just what he went through. It's not telling you that's all there is to it. But that's where the art lies in it anyway. Yeah.
So do you have a particular type of story that you like to tell?
I don't know. I guess what I'd say to that is that in recent years, what's really interested me in terms of story is the process and the experience of finding my way into that story and reliving and feeling that experience again. And the process of going through it again becomes kind of fascinating. I like stories like that because they're deep. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're not about taking a trip to the grocery store to pick up some milk and heading home or something. They're more about the experience itself, and then finding out maybe something that you didn't know about how that experience affected you as you draw it. And then as you draw it, you see something deeper than you knew that was there. I like that. I really enjoy doing that. This also answers your question too about what it is that I like about doing really personal memoir stories. You can really just go a lot deeper, in my experience anyway, telling your own personal story than I could by making something up. So, but I like a lot of different kinds of stories. What I've often been drawn to, you asked me about earlier career stuff and stuff that I was doing. A lot of my stuff, I've always had a really deep fascination with crime. And crime is always just a great topic to work with because there's inherent conflict. And in a way, this is the ultimate Glenn Head crime comic. this thing of Terrence Michael Lynch, who, he does all this stuff. He commits crimes against all these people, and those people are affected by it. And finally, my character, later on in the story, finds out what became of him. And so you've definitely got this crime and punishment aspect that's lurking in it that, as I say, I relate to crime comics a little bit. The things that people do to each other and how they affect each other criminally, I've always found really fascinating. And it's also simply because, as soon as you delve into crime, you're delving into the id, the things that we're not supposed to do, the things that we might want to do, but we know we can't because there's laws, and it's that stuff that we keep hidden. And again, keeping things hidden, that's one of the reasons for memoir, because you are not keeping things hidden. You're going to places that are being exposed. That's one of the reasons for memoir, to show what, as I say, is in between the panels, so to speak.
And I think it really shows. I feel like this book is extremely unique. It's not the kind of thing that you normally see around the sort of comics spectrum, just from the way it's printed in black and white, to the number of pages, to the type of story it tells. The triumph over adversity. I feel like it's an extremely unique book, and I think that matters a lot.
Well, it can't hurt. I'm not trying to get on any bandwagons or anything like that, especially at this stage of my life. But I'm glad you see it that way. I hope it is unique. I wouldn't think that there have been that many stories done this way or on this particular subject either. I wouldn't know, because, as I said earlier, I don't really read comics, but I don't really think that there has been much of this kind of thing,
Was printing it in black and white an artistic decision, or was it just what happened naturally?
The truth of it is that's sort of my answer to that is the same one as what I might say about stylistic choices. It's like, it feels like these choices were made for me a long time ago. I grew up with black and white comics. I've done some color comics. Realistically speaking, though, and this was not something I thought out, but one thing that I'm really influenced by film and photography. And if you're influenced by photography, you're going to really like black and white photography in a lot of cases. A lot of the great stuff like Diane Arbus, Robert Frank, Lee Friedlander, all these great photographers, it was black and white work that they did. And a lot of the compositional elements are really related to the use of black and white. Now, when I studied comics, as I say, I was looking at Dick Tracy and things like that. And Dick Tracy is a very black and white comic. And as I say, I was also really into film. And the whole thing of film noir and the extreme expressionism and the angles that you could get in those movies. Everything feels like it's at some sort of sharp right angle. The camera could be tilted, and the look of it could be unnerving. And that kind of unnerving quality that those film noir movies had is something I really like, because that's a sort of quasi-reality as well, in the same way that the way I draw is kind of a quasi-reality. It's not real reality. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be the reality that I experienced. And that's how a lot of film noir movies worked too, with like some doomed anti-hero who was living something that might actually even just be occurring in his head, or it might actually be occurring, but it was trouble and he was in a difficult place. He was cornered. That's something I always really respond to. As I say, there's elements of crime in a lot of that too, which is another mainstay for me. But black and white is just something that it's the first way I would think to draw anything. I would otherwise not really, I cannot imagine doing an entire book in color. I don't know how people do it. I will also say, though, that like the color I grew up with, when I saw it and liked it, it almost emphasized its imperfections, not on purpose. It's just that, they used to do, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but these were called hand color seps, which was like acetate that you laid over and you cut out zipatone and you laid these tones on top of one another to get the colors that you got. So that's what, if you've seen any comics from dating back to, I don't know, we'll say 1990 or something, maybe earlier, that's how they were done. And Photoshop color hadn't made it in yet, so things were off register. So there was this kind of charming aspect to that clunkiness of those kinds of comics. You'd never get that now. So that the comics that, that mainstream comics they've got like the most awesome, incredible color shading and everything else going on in there you can even imagine. It's not my thing, but then, we're always in a state of evolution with comics, just as we are in any art form. And, eventually I adapted to the graphic novel. It took me a little while to really get my hands around that. But who knows, man? Maybe at some point I'll do a color comic. I don't know.
Nice. Yeah, I remember those, the color separation strips. You had to line them up exactly right. And they had this smell to them.
Yeah, they were weird. I mean, it made the whole comics medium seem more primitive back then, too. And that's one thing that, come to think of it, you would never think of comics as being now. You would never think of the medium as being in any way primitive. You might find some artists who have a primitiveness about their work, maybe, but the medium itself is just like, it's like the movie game practically in terms of, the kind of slickness and perfection that you can get, As I say, that's part of how it goes. And let's face it, nobody would want, as charming as those off-register color seps might be for someone else, if you were the person that did it, that kind of thing, you probably weren't too happy with it. So the point is that, like, at this point, we're much closer to getting things as artists exactly as we might really want them to print. I've been doing this a long time, and there are plenty of comics that, you draw them, you get them all worked out. You might even get the blue lines, as they used to call them, the proofs. And then you get something back that didn't quite measure up to what you thought you were going to get, because the printer might have, there might have been a bad day in terms of the inks or whatever it was. So they've kind of like fixed a lot of what might go wrong, which we really shouldn't complain about if be happy about.
So, who would you say your biggest artistic influences are?
My biggest artistic influences. It's kind of hard to nail that down to a few people, but I definitely would say Robert Crumb, because he was one of the first people I saw, and he was willing to go to really dark places, and he was just going to draw it. He didn't care if you didn't like it. At least that was the experience I got of it. I mean, that's my whole take on a lot of the comics I grew up reading, was that they were going to do what they were going to do, and they were pushing the envelope in a lot of ways. Some ways that were like easy, like in terms of sex and violence and crazy behavior and all that stuff. But they were also pushing the envelope in a sense of what I was talking about earlier, which was autobiography, which first made its way into comics seriously in, the early 70s. Some of the books that people did, like Justin Green is a huge influence, because he did a book that I can really relate to, that my book sort of has an antecedent in, which is, neuroses, or he dealt with a lot of stuff in the Catholic Church, and how that affected him as a kid and how it followed him around into his adulthood, that's sort of the beginning of a lot of this kind of work and the work that I do. It definitely comes right out of that. I read that and really liked it as a kid, but it took me a little while longer to really get that. And so some of my biggest influences relate to that book. And there were other comics too that I was looking at back then that were they were trouble for the sake of being trouble. And I really liked that. The same way that I really liked rock and roll, because a lot of it was just troublemaking. And that kind of rebellious spirit that was a part of underground comics really grabbed me. I wanted a piece of that. That made sense to me. In the same way that I mentioned hanging out with these juvenile delinquent type kids at Chartwell Manor and kind of being a hanger-on and maybe getting involved in some of the bad behavior and maybe not. That's kind of what underground comics did, where I wanted a piece of that and I wanted to, in whatever way, become a part of. And yeah, a lot of it was troublemaking, but some of it isn't. At its best, it's trying to push the medium forward, and it's taking a lot of risks. And that was the thing that really grabbed me about Crumb's work, is that he was always willing to take risks. He was going to do what he was going to do, and sometimes he was just having fun. I mean, the way he drew women, for instance, I don't think he was doing that for anybody but him. I think he just likes drawing women like that, so he did it. But there was a lot of stuff getting done at that time that was willing to cross boundaries into dangerous places. And that's something that's always really attracted me. Like some of these things are just phases that you may well go through, especially as a young kid. How guys end up liking William Burroughs or Charles Bukowski because they represent a kind of behavior that's outside the norm of what they've grown up in. And so they become really attracted to that. Again, it's this thing of stepping outside the norm. And you want some of that. As a cartoonist, I think you really want that, because I think that antagonism is actually a big deal in comics. I think that that's partly what cartooning is about, is being antagonistic, especially with underground comics. Like, you tell me I can't draw this, I'm going to draw it. You tell me I can't use this as subject matter, I'm going to use it as subject matter. That can be a little juvenile, but it can also be that rebellious thing is valid.
Oh, for sure. Do you find that you're still a rebel?
I'm a little old, long in the tooth for that, but I feel like I'm in touch with that part of drawing a book like Chartwell Manner. There's a part of most people, they would think twice before drawing this book. They would think twice before putting themselves in it and showing themselves do some of the things that they do. And so in that respect, that rebelliousness has not left me at all. It hasn't gone away a bit, because I'm going to draw what I'm going to draw, and nobody's going to stop me, is my attitude, is my feeling. And so I guess that does answer the question in the affirmative. There is a little bit of rebellion still going on in me.
That's awesome. Well, Glenn, I wanted to thank you for doing us the honor of popping on my humble little podcast. I think this was just such an incredibly insightful interview. Thank you.
Great. I'm really glad to have done it. Really enjoyed speaking with you.
Likewise. Where can people find you online?
Oh, sure. Glenhead Comics, Instagram. And mainly that. I'm not really involved with much else, but Glenhead Comics, Instagram will work. And Fantagraphics is the publisher of Chartwell Manner. And as I say, it will be released on the 25th of May.
And now it's time to close the show. Imagine it. The lights beginning to come on in an empty theater. People starting to get up from their seats. The smell of popcorn crushed on the floor. And the thought runs through your head that Titular Characters is awesome and you want to support it. Fear not, my friends. There are tons of ways to do it. You can follow Eva at Eva is Adorable on Twitter. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Castbox, or Podcast Addict. And if you're feeling super generous, you can leave some dough at buymeacoffee.com/Eva is Adorable. There, you can contribute as little as $1. And every bit goes towards paying for production and hosting of this show. How cool is that? Titular Characters is a show about the things we love. It is produced and hosted by the adorable Eva Webb. Opening theme by Antonia Marquis. Closing theme by Mikey Flash of Speed Force Music. The dreamy announcer guy who reads the credits is Donnie Underwood. That's me. Join us next time for another death-defying adventure in cyberspace. See you then.